Welcome to the Existential Empath Podcast. My name is Tanya, and I am an intuitive empath. My intention is to share valuable tips, tools, and techniques that I have learned so you can tap into your own inner healer naturally and intuitively. Welcome back, everyone. Today I have guest Jamal Jivanjee. Jamal is a life coach, host of the Lovecast with Jamal podcast, and best-selling author of Living for a Living. Jamal has traveled around the globe and has more than 20 years experience working with people in various stages of personal struggle and challenges. Jamal helps identify and clear energetic systems of belief that create fear, disharmony, and disease. He seeks to restore awareness of the ever-present and innate divine flow of abundance, goodwill, and love that exists in us all. Welcome, Jamal. It's a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much, Tanya. It's just a pleasure to be here. I'm glad we can make this happen. Thank you.
Me too. I know we've had some obstacles trying to get this show together, but here we are today, and we are going to share some really valuable information out into the world. So we are going to talk about living for a living, divinely aligned and free. So Jamal, before we dive into what living for a living means and how we do that, I feel it's pertinent to talk about what living for a living is not. And because that's probably what many people in the world are doing right now. And so, there are things that block us from living divinely aligned and free. And those things could be pain and suffering. So we're going to dive a little bit into that first. So Jamal, what is the difference between pain and suffering?
Yes, I love that question because most people use the words as if they're synonymous with each other, right? But I've come to understand that these are very, very different words. So pain is a part of life. I always like to say pain just, things happen, and pain is almost a physiological experience. So for a very simple example I like to use a lot is, let's say you're walking across the floor and you stub your toe in the middle of the night. I did this not too long ago. It was I think I left a barbell or something. I was sitting on the floor and middle of the night, didn't know it was there, stubbed my toe into it. That's excruciatingly painful. As anybody would
that
know,
is no fun.
When you stub your toe, it's like life just is over, whatever, it becomes apocalyptic in that moment. It's like there is nothing left. This is just emergency. And that goes on for like 30 seconds, a minute. And then what you notice is that the pain subsides a little bit. It's like a wave, right? A wave comes, it crests, and then it subsides. Pain is like that. There is a cycle to it, beginning, middle, end. And once it subsides, you can come back to awareness of reality. Okay, I'm back to life. Life's not over. I'm still loved. I'm still here. So it's okay. So after a few minutes, it goes away. Suffering's a bit different, however. Suffering is different than pain. Suffering is really narrative based. If we look at suffering long enough, we can say, oh, there's a story here.
Yeah.
And the story doesn't end with the physiological experience. So for example, let's say I stub my toe. Pain is there. Yes. It's, it crests, there's, and then it subsides. But suffering is the narrative. Maybe I get into this narrative, and the narrative is, I live with really inconsiderate people. I don't know who leaves stuff on the floor like this, but this is the story of my life. I can't walk across the floor without stubbing my toe. This is the way I live. Now that's a whole narrative, right? Maybe a little bit simple or not the best analogy, but that's kind of an example of, now that narrative is going to continue long after the pain goes away. But that narrative really, the energy of that is very dense, very heavy, and it keeps us in this cycle of suffering. And that's the major difference between pain and suffering. Suffering is attached to a narrative. Pain, I've heard another person put it this way: pain is an event. Suffering is the story we tell about the event.
Yes. And it creates momentum, right? Energetic momentum, because, say you stub your toe and then weeks go on and you're still sharing the story of you stubbing your toe 2 weeks ago, but the pain has subsided, but yet you're still suffering from stubbing your toe. And, we create these stories and we tell them over and over and over again. So Jamal, what is the root cause of suffering? Why do we do this to ourselves?
Yes. And I always ask people, like, if you had a choice, would you suffer or would you not suffer? I know it sounds like a very simple question. People are
With a
like, well, of
simple
course I
answer.
wouldn't suffer. Yeah, nobody would suffer. And it's like, okay, where does suffering happen? I always like to ask, what is the location of something? If you can find the location of it, you can address it. And people are like, what do you mean, where is it? I was like, yeah, it's not outside, right? It's not down the street. It's not in somebody else's house. Like, where is suffering? It's always within us.
Mhm.
So I always come back and say, do you have control over what's happening within you? And if the answer is yes, then it's like, why are you suffering then? So then the answer must be no, I don't have control. And that's why we suffer, because we don't have control over what's going on inside of this dimension, this state of being inside. And that's simply because we haven't learned how to do that. But it is possible. I always say, though, there's a lot of things we don't control in life, right? That we don't control the economy. We don't control the weather. We certainly don't control other people. But what do we have control? There's only really a few things that we have 100% control over. And one of those dimensions of life that we actually do have control over is our inner state of being.
Yeah. And that comes down
So,
to our choices, right? We have a choice to choose thoughts that create
mhm,
more suffering, or we have a choice to choose thoughts that don't create more suffering. It's just becoming more consciously aware of where we're
mhm.
focusing our energy and our attention.
Totally. And there's these scripts that are running, right? When we talk about a story, right, that suffering is attached to a story, where the story is actually following a script. And that script, and the reason this can be so challenging for folks is because the script it's not out in the open. It's embedded. It's kind of like like
HTML.
yeah, it's like
It's
computer
like some
code, right?
code in
It's
there.
because when you operate on a computer, right, you're looking at your desktop, you see icons and folders and you're interacting with them, but there's no folders there. There's no icons there. Those they appear to be there, but it's just the way the processor is processing code or information. It's ones and zeros. Well, in the same way, at the subconscious level of our mind, there is coding there. And this coding is basically, if we're going to boil it down to its simplest form, what is it? It's memory. It's an accumulation of past memory. These memories come in the form, they have come through to us through events that we've experienced, belief systems, but a lot of it is unconscious, meaning it was passed down to us through family dynamics, previous energy that came before us even, and that we inherit. And then a lot of that programming, it's an accumulation over time. It's kind of like when you live in a house for a while, you start to accumulate a lot of things, right? And so in the same way, your mental construct, we all have a mental construct of what it means to be who we are. That mental construct is the story. It's an accumulation over time of events and situations and beliefs. It's actually not who we are, but we have so identified with that story that we can't, in the beginning, we really cannot tell the difference between the story and ourself. We have so identified with the story. And this is what keeps suffering happening, keeps perpetuating suffering.
Yeah, and let's look at that from a larger scale because, I've always said this, even the word history, his story, right? That's it, her story, whatever, it's just that concept of it's a story. And when we continue to share story upon generation, upon generation, upon generation, that's
Yes.
energy. And I work a lot with clearing homes and crossing over earthbound spirits. And this is something that had actually come up in my reality as I had cleared a home, and the earthbound spirit, I had asked, why are you here? And they said, because you keep telling my story. It's anchoring me
Wow.
here into this world. And so, let's talk about this, Jamal. What is the
Hmm.
solution to human suffering? Because I think this is the microcosm to the macrocosm here, because there's a larger picture that we need to look at, because as a humanity, we have a lot of struggle and we have a lot of suffering, and we don't need to because we're divine beings. So let's talk
Mm.
about this.
Yes, absolutely. And I love what you're sharing there. That's a powerful story of right? So that we keep telling the story, which keeps, and there's energy connected to the story, right? An entity, a being, whatever, we may understand that to be. There are lots of dimensions of existence that we are not aware of. But when the attachment to these things come from past events, past situations that come through in a story. So the solution, I would tell people, and this, some people will push back. I'll say nobody ever has any problems right now, right? You've experienced a lot of problems in the past, a lot of suffering, maybe some trauma, of course, in the past. Yeah. And then when we imagine the future, we, can imagine problems, right? We imagine situations that we don't like, and that creates fear. But there's no future. It doesn't exist anywhere. Where is that? The past doesn't exist. So if you could somehow, so all the future is when the mind creates a future, it has to have a reference point.
Yeah.
How can we create this imagination? Well, the way the brain works is that it borrows from previous experience and then creates a blueprint of what's possible based upon previous experience. So it's simply just regurgitating the past. That's all it is. Now, if we could somehow move the past out of the way, if you had no past reference points and all you had was this moment, well, what's the problem? Right? There's no problem in this moment. In this moment, we're fine. I'm fine. You're fine.
I'm clearly living on the beach right now.
We're here, right? We're having this amazing conversation. All the problems I can think of are in the future, which is really just a regurgitation of the past.
And so those are the problems that may not even exist, right?
Totally.
Because we're basing them off of past experience.
Totally. But the good news about the past is that it does not exist. It actually has never existed. Even whatever happened in the past, when we experienced it, it was the present. So the only reason it has such a story or such a stranglehold and cause such suffering is because it's repeating past narratives. But the past does not exist. So that means how are we here in this moment? A lot of us are unconsciously, we tend to think of our beginning, my beginning, your beginning, the beginning of the universe. We tend to think of back in the past, but the roots of our existence are not in the past because there is no past. It does not exist. The past is a creation of the human psyche. So that means the root of our existence is right now. So the beginning of our existence is not in the past. It's actually in this moment, the very beginnings. So what is possible in the beginning? Well, everything, right? Because I don't have a reference point that has, so the past is always going to be limiting because you haven't experienced everything in the past, right? We haven't experienced all things. We have, the past is limited because it's literally limited to what we've experienced. So if the past is my reference point, I cannot experience new situations. I can't create anything new. All I can do is regurgitate the past. But if the beginnings of my being is in this moment, then what I can create from this moment is really the possibilities are infinite.
Yeah.
And that's where people can start to experience something new in their life. They can start to create something new that goes beyond the limitations of the past.
Yeah. And it reminds me of, say, for example, this is an analogy. Someone lives in Florida their whole life. And so they grow up seeing palm trees and the beach and the sun, but they've never seen snow. They've never heard of snow. They don't even believe snow exists because they've never experienced snow. But then they travel to Alaska and they experience snow. It expands their consciousness. It expands their possibilities. And maybe they decide to move to Alaska, and then they have a whole new experience. So, we are really, it's like when we're living in that now moment, it's really subject to what's going on around us in our environment too. And we can shift that at any time by creating momentum, by making a choice, by moving in a certain direction. And what that does is it just creates more possibilities and more possibilities. And it's like going on a road trip and saying, I'm going to turn, right this time, and then I'm going to turn left, and maybe I'll turn right a few more times. And every single time you take that trip, you could experience new things because you're making new choices, and you're making a new choice to take a right or a left, or to turn around, or to go forward, whatever you want to do. But that's where we come into this endless possibilities. And, many of us, Jamal, I think we get stuck on the same road or the same path or the same timeline, whatever you want to call it. And so, how do we shift ourselves out of that? How do we, it's like, and I felt like this when I was working in healthcare. I thought my whole life, I'm just going to be working in healthcare and this is boring. I wasn't enjoying it, and then I thought, no, I have endless possibilities. So now here I am doing a podcast and, things I wouldn't have thought I was doing 10 years ago. So how do we shift these stories within ourselves? And, especially for people who are struggling, in this area.
Well, one of the a very powerful and simple. So sometimes I think people have a tendency to overcomplicate things or overthink things. Change can happen really quickly and really simply because we're talking about energy. Everything is energy. So our life is not something that you can read about. Like you can't. I mean, I could write a book about my life. In some ways I have. You could write a book about your life and someone could read the book and that's great. It's not a problem. And it could spur, it could inspire, it could do a lot of things. But if you really want to experience your own life, you can't read about it. You actually have to experience it. So how do you experience life? So people talk about living life on purpose, right? And I'm a huge fan of purpose and being anchored to your purpose. And again, we make that very complicated. I don't know my purpose. What's my purpose? I have no idea.
That's my number one question with clients, that what is my purpose?
What is my purpose? I'll say, well, there's a lot of layers to that, right? There are, my understanding is that we're all here to do specific work in the world. Yes. And if we start there, it can be really complex, So I always say, it's like health, right? Health is another thing. If we start paying attention to our health and we start, let's say we get this, unfortunately, get a diagnosis of some terminal disease. And then if I say, okay, I want to start paying attention to my health, much more challenging at that level. It can be done, but it's much more challenging. I always say, let's start where it's simple, right? Let's start paying attention to our life. So the first purpose, let's start paying attention to our purpose. What's our first purpose? For everybody, I can say the first purpose of life is to live it, to experience it. I know that sounds really cliche, but you can't experience your life if you're trying to get somewhere. So if we're trying to get to the future, and a lot of us, because we're suffering, we're going, okay, I don't have enough money. My relationships aren't good right now. I feel stuck. So immediately the mind starts creating an escape. Well, maybe the future will be different. Maybe it'll be better in the future. Well, I like to ask people, what have you ever experienced in the future? Anything? Nothing.
It reminds me of job interviews. Where do you see yourself 10 years in the future? I'm like, really? I don't know.
Totally. So really, honestly, in order to experience your life, you cannot be in the future because there is no future. You have to experience it now. So I always say, let's go back to how do you experience your life right now? Sensations. There are certain sensations. So we may have a tendency to think of, have fear-based thoughts or anxious thoughts about the future. And we say, okay, that's fine. When you think of the future and you feel worried about the future, it feels limiting, it feels impossible, it feels stuck, or you're worried about how things are going to work out. Okay, that's a thought. There are thoughts there. What does that thought feel like? What is the sensation of that thought in this moment in your body? Like, does it feel, typically it's heavy. Yeah. There's a heaviness in the chest. It's hard to breathe, right? There's some anxious, restrictive. And I always say, okay, that's where you want to shift it. Pay attention, feel that thought. That's telling you something. Truth never feels restrictive. My experience is that truth doesn't feel heavy and dense and scary. And if there's fear, like there's the sensation of all those sensations of fear and density and feeling limited and powerless. Those are actual sensations that are showing you what's not in alignment with you, with who you actually are. Those are out of alignment. It's there for contrast. It's there to show you what's not. You need it. It's good. And so you can say, oh, thank you for showing me what's not in alignment with the truth.
Yeah. Because you wouldn't know what sadness is unless you experienced blissfulness. It's like we need that contrast.
Totally do. So then I say, okay, let's shift the thought to see if I can shift the sensation. So it's an experiment. So we're learning how to experiment and say, okay, let's change this. So when I say, I don't know how I'm going to experience abundance in the future, but I'm learning how to perceive the abundance that I have in this moment. And just by saying that, you can say, oh, there's abundance in this moment. I'm learning how to perceive the abundance that I have in this moment. I don't know how things are going to work out in the future, but I'm learning how to see how they're working out for me right now in this moment. Just that statement. Then I say, tune into your body. How does that feel? Does that feel a little lighter? Is that a little lighter? Is the sensations a little bit more? Okay, great. Because then just by doing that experiment, you can start to shift that energy. You're starting to move out of past reference points to the present. So there's reference points in the present. If we can learn how to anchor to present tense reference points, we will start to become conscious of abundance, because this abundance is always present.
Yeah. And it's directing our focus on it, right? So if you're focusing on the abundance that you think you may not have in the future, but you're abundant in this current moment, shift your thoughts. Focus on the abundance you currently have in this moment. And what
Absolutely.
you're doing is you're restructuring the vibration. You're setting the frequency, right?
Yes. And what that does is it actually does create the future.
Yeah.
So
you're creating the future in the now moment.
In the now moment. So and this is a statement that's used in these circles and coaching circles a lot, where focus goes, energy flows. And so where the energy is flowing is you're going to create and manifest where you're putting focus. It's just like a plant. If you water a plant and give the plant sunlight, it's going to thrive. In the same way, where your focus goes, that's going to thrive. If we know this just very practically, like if you have a relationship and you're not putting attention or energy into it, it's going to suffer. If your health, if whatever we call good health, all of that is simply focus. I paid attention to what my body needs. I paid attention to what I'm eating, how I'm sleeping. Then health is the result, right? Everything, life flourishes when we pay attention to it. So if you pay attention to the past, that'll flourish. And if you don't like the past, if it's limiting, well, we don't want that to flourish. So let's pay attention to something different.
I love that. I love the analogy of watering the plant, because, it starts and you have a seed and it's under the dirt and you don't see it, but every day you're diligently watering the plant. And then soon enough, you start to see this little sprout grow. And then before you know it, there's a huge plant. And yesterday I heard a saying, and it said, trust the process, even when you don't see the processing happening. And that kind of hit me hard, because that's like watering a plant, right? You're like, okay, I don't see the sprout yet, but I'm going to continue to water this. I'm going to put focus towards it. I'm going to nurture this. I'm going to give it positive energy, positive thoughts. And before you know it, you have a big, beautiful plant in front of you. And you're like, how did that happen? Right. But it's really being consistent and creating momentum in a certain direction that you desire. So that way you are creating your future in this now moment. And I love this conversation because it's deep.
it totally. And I think a lot of folks aren't yet convinced of how creation happens, right? We're kind of trained to feel like, oh, if it's not in my physical proximity, if I can't see it, taste it, touch it, have it in this moment, then it doesn't exist. And what that does is, when we buy into that paradigm, then we're waiting. We're waiting for that money to show up. We're waiting for that relationship to come in. We're waiting for the future to get here. And I've heard it said this way: if you're waiting, you're not living, right? Because what are you waiting for? Because, a farmer, if you look at a farmer who plants some seeds in the ground, they understand the process, right? Okay, the seed has to get planted, right? And then it has to get watered. And over time, eventually the crop will come. They're not in denial about that. So let's say a farmer plants a field on a Friday. It's a Friday, and they put down some seed and they cover it up, and a Monday rolls around and someone comes and says, hey, how's it going? Well, you would never hear a farmer go, oh, this is a disaster. Look, I planted this, and look, there's nothing. I'm looking at the ground. There's nothing happening, right? A farmer wouldn't do that because farmer's like, oh, it's great.
The process.
they trust it. They understand how creation works. Believe it or not, farming is a great analogy for living, because everything starts at the seed form. Everything. Wow. If we just pay attention to life, everything begins at the seed level. Well, when you create something, it has to start at the seed level. Well, what is the seed level? It's not when go back to the farming analogy, when you harvest the crop is always the last stage. We tend to look at that as the first stage.
Yeah, true.
It's the last stage.
The money.
Right. When it finally shows up. but it's created the moment you've put your focus. So what is an intention? An intention, my understanding of an intention is simply focused awareness. That's all it is focused awareness. As soon as you focus your awareness into a certain thing you may want or desire, immediately the seed now exists. Mm-hmm. And that seed is planted as soon as you focus on it. So if you can understand that, then you can, what happens is you become more receptive, less resistive, stress goes away. Okay, it's in process.
Yeah.
Oh, it's in process.
And then you're nurturing it. You don't smother it, right? You don't set that intention. And then every day you're like, where is it? Where is it? Where is it? It's not here. Right. I set this intention, not like watering a plant. You're not over watering it. It's not growing. I'm going to flood the plant, no, you're going to just nurture it, put a little thought and focus towards it every day, and then just go about your day. And before you know it, it'll appear in the physical reality. And I hear that a lot with my clients is I am waiting for ... whatever it is. And I always shift their words around. I am aligning with, because when you're doing that, you are shifting your vibration, you're shifting your frequency. Waiting is a frequency. It's out there. You're going to be waiting to the end of time when you're using that frequency, because it's out there. You're not attracting it. You're just waiting for it. You're sitting there waiting for something to happen. But when you're aligning, you're actually shifting your vibration to be able to magnetize it into your life.
100%. Absolutely. I love that.
Yeah. And so let's talk about your book, Living for a Living. And let's talk about that. I know we briefly discussed what that's like to be living for a living, but when you actually embody this into your life, I think a lot of us can sit around and say, oh yeah, I live for a living, but they probably say it in a more sarcastic way, where you and I, Jamal, we're literally living for a living and we're in the flow state. So let's talk about that.
Yes, absolutely. Well, the title of the book, Living for a Living, it comes out of a frustration, throughout my life growing up. People would always ask, we understand this question. What do you want to do for a living? What do you want to do when you grow up? What do you want to do for a living? But I grew up in a family, and in the book, I talk a little bit more of the details of my family. My dad grew up in East Africa. It's from Indian descent originally, but grew up in East Africa. A lot of struggle and poverty, instability in that part of the world. My mother grew up in Ohio, and southeastern Ohio. Totally. And it's, kind of an Appalachian culture where there was in some aspects of her family, there was a lot of generational struggle and poverty. So I came into the world with this sense of just angst, and that the focus, what I witnessed in my parents was that there was a really strong focus to survive. Literally all their life's energy and focus went on to going to work every day, making the money, paying the bills, because bills have to get paid. And that was the number one priority. This is what you do in life. So I picked up certain narrative, which is life's hard. You have to leverage your time for money so that you can survive. And that never made sense to me. Even as a child, I remember going, and I appreciated my mother worked, she had a job. She worked for the state of Ohio. It paid well, good benefits, especially for where she, her dynamic and the family she came from. I mean, it was like, you kind of hit the gold mine if you got that kind of a job. You're secure, Problem is that she hated her job. It was a good job, paid good money, very secure, but she didn't like it. Matter of fact, she hated it so much that when she would get up in the morning, sometimes she would actually vomit. She'd throw up. She'd be sick to her stomach. She did this for 30 years. She retired at this job. I watched this every day. And I was always somebody who I was very curious from day one. As early as I can remember, I was always asking questions. Why do people, I'm paying attention to everything. And I'm watching my mother and I'm going, she is suffering. She's miserable. And yet she does it for us. So I have these mixed messages. I felt gratitude. I felt appreciation for her sacrifice. At the end of the day, I kept saying, is that my life? I don't want to grow up and do that. I don't want to grow up and work for a living, doing something I really despise. And so when people talk about living or working, what do you do for a living? I'm going, well, my mother's not living. To me, that's a shell of a life.
Yeah.
That's not truly living.
Mm-mm.
even though I appreciate it, I'm like, I want to know what it means to live fully. So the number one threat to living, in my understanding, is survival, is the need to survive. Because I'm like, well, what do you do once you survive? It's kind of like, I need gas money, So if I sell the car for gas money, what do I do with the gas money? I don't have a car anymore. So it's the same way. People trade their life away for money so they can live. And it's like, but you just gave your life away. The
I see
best.
that too. Yeah, with Jamal, with retirement, people would be like, "Oh, I'm saving up for retirement," and then I would see them pass away in 3 years, and I'm like, "You just saved up all this money to spend it to finally live when you turn 65, and then you end up passing away at 68." I mean, so it's like we have been programmed as a society to think that living is out there, right? We're
Yeah,
waiting to
it's the
live.
future. It's the future. And survival is important, and so I wrote the book to describe. So I started off like anybody else, trying to survive, trying to make it. And I realized, I'm not here to make it. I'm here to live. And if I live, I'll make it. But if I just make it, I may not live. So my life was on a trajectory to learn what this means. And so the book really details my trajectory. So when you're working for survival, what you do is based upon survival. But when you're living for a living, it doesn't mean you don't work. People think, oh, so we're just not here to work. Like, no, my understanding is that we all have work to do in the world, but the work isn't to so we can survive. The work is so that we can actually live fully, experience, because remember, that's the number one purpose, to live fully, and to experience there's a joy and satisfaction that comes when you're in alignment with what you're wired, what you're here to do. And when you're doing that work, it's extremely satisfying and other people benefit. So there's an economy that when you're working for a living, not for survival, that actually the world is being benefited, that you are making this world a better place, other people are benefiting, and your joy is also being maximized in the process of that. And so living for a living is moving out of an economy of survival to an economy of love and service. And that's what the book is about. And it is possible, but we have to come away from a lot of thinking, right? A lot of scarcity thinking. My dad would always say, money doesn't grow on trees.
Yep, I've heard
You have
those
to work,
too. You have to
to
work
work
really hard
really
to make
hard.
money. Mm-hmm.
And I always say, how much did it cost to create the world? How much money did it take to create the universe? None.
Energy.
Zero.
Mm-hmm.
Just energy. And believe it or not, every single one of us has access to that same energy.
And it's abundant and it's
abundant.
infinite. It's
Infinite.
beyond infinite, if there's even a word for that.
Totally. And the way we access it is by moving from obligation and survival to desire, because that's the engine of it. And I had a person one time read my book, and he read the book, and I don't think he understood the book. So he said, I like the book, but it's just not for me. I said, okay. I said, well, why is it not for you? He said, well, because I'm not fortunate. I'm not privileged. And I said, well, okay, well, what does that mean? He said, well, not all of us can live for a living. Some of us have to work. And I said, okay, I didn't understand that. So I said,
right there, I'd immediately be like, there is a trapped emotion of unworthiness right there. Bing, bing, bing. Yeah.
Very perceptive. Absolutely. So I said, oh, okay. So you say you have to work. I was like, why do you have to work? He's like, well, because I got to pay the bills. So I got to put food on the table. That's what I have to do. I said, oh, okay. So you feel like you have to work, and you don't really. He goes, no, I don't like my job, but I have to do it. And I said, let me challenge you right there. He said, well, if I had money, I wouldn't do this job. Like if I had a lot of money, I would just quit. I was like, oh, okay. And that's the whole thing, right? I want to get that money so I can live for a living.
The money. Yeah.
I can move into the direction. Mm-hmm. So I said, actually, I think let me challenge you there. You don't actually have to go to work. He's like, what do you mean? I was like, you don't actually have to go to work. He's like, sure, I do. I was like, why do you say that? He's like, because my kids would starve. I put my kids through school. I put food on the table. I'm paying the mortgage. He's like, I couldn't do that if I didn't work. I said, okay, what if, God forbid, let's just say you go to work today and your boss comes and says, hey, they call you into the office. They say, we're sorry. There's cutbacks and we're going to have to let you go. I was like, what would you do? And he said, it's funny you mentioned that. He said, because that's actually happening at my company. A
Oh,
lot of
wow.
people have been let go. He said, I think my job's pretty safe for now, but that has happened. I said, well, what if it happened to you? What would you do? He goes, well, I'd do something. I was like, oh, you mean your life wouldn't be over? He's like, no. I was like, what would you do? He's like, well, I would probably look for something else. I was like, yeah, you'd look for another job. I was like, and he's like, and you may have to get on some assistance until then. I was like, okay. I was like, so you have options, right? So there's some options.
There's
He's like,
choices. Mhm.
yeah. He's like, okay, great. I was like, so you don't have to do this. I was like, you can quit. I was like, why don't you just quit your job? Just quit. Put the resignation in. Why are you doing this? Quit your job. He's like, what do you mean? And I was like, look, you just said you have options. There are options. You can look for a new job. You can get on assistance. You don't have to go to work. He's like, well, I may not like my job, but I do like that it takes care of my needs. I said, oh, okay. So what I'm hearing you say now is that there's some aspect of this job that you like. He's like, well, I guess so. Yeah. I was like, oh, okay. So you're choosing not to quit. Is that what you're saying? You're choosing not to quit. He's like, that's right. I'm choosing not to quit. I'm like, you see where I'm going with this? I was like, you're choosing. Now that's not have to. That's choice. When you say I have to work, you're saying I don't have a choice.
I'm
You do.
choosing to work.
You're choosing to. I was like, so I was like, is there anything? I was like, so now you're choosing something you want. You like how it supplies and takes care of your family. That's beautiful. Great. Focus. If you just focus on that a little bit, I'm sure there's one more thing about this job that you kind of enjoy a little bit. Maybe not. He's like, well, yeah, I was like, what? And then so we kind of got into that. I said, the moment you start shifting from have to this energy of I get to, I'm choosing to, you're now moving out of survival to desire.
Uh-huh.
And that energy will keep going and keep going. And the more you follow it, the more doors will open, more doors will open. And then you will eventually, that leads you to actually being exactly where you want to be in life. But we think it's in the future. It's like, no, you shift that energy now. And it's always done in the perception. So living for living can happen pretty immediately.
Yeah, and that's powerful. Wow. And even work is a perception. Some people perceive work as 9 to 5 and the daily grind. Some people perceive work living on a boat writing books, right? Some people perceive work doing coaching 3 hours a day. It's very different how we all perceive work, and then how we also kind of align the monetary aspect with that as well. And so I think you touched on that. It's all about perception, and we have to sometimes shift our perception on, especially the way we were taught. How you and I, sounds like we grew up very similarly. I grew up in Western New York, which is similar to Ohio. It's not far from there, but very small town. Dad worked really hard, and mom took care of us, and then mom went to be a teacher and worked really hard to take care of us. And so I kind of grew up with that, and I've had to shift my perception around what work means to me, in my life. And I love this. I love that we're talking about this, because this is, as humanity, we all are going through a perception shift, right now. And what you perceive is different than what I perceive. And it's always going to be that way, because we're all looking through different lenses, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So well said.
Different frequencies, different vibrations. And, I'll notice that I'll see, when I start to find myself in a certain frequency, I'll, find myself not communicating with certain people, or certain people will reach out to me, and I'm like, I can kind of tell who's in my vibration, who's in my frequency. And it's funny
So
how
good.
you talked about that in the beginning, how we need to feel into our body, feel what that fear feels like, feel what that restriction feels like, feel what it feels like to be free. And I want to talk
Yes.
about that, Jamal. What does it feel like to be in alignment? I know what it feels like, but I want us to verbalize it.
For me, when I can always tell when I'm moving into alignment, because there's an excitement. It's not results based, right? So what I've noticed is that when I focus on the result, will this result in income? Will this result in some door opening? That feels dense. That feels heavy. But as soon as I contemplate an action or do something and it feels kind of exciting, or there's a lightness, I go, oh, there's a clue. There's some alignment there. So alignment feels exciting to me. It feels possible. It feels like the sense of, oh, anything could happen from this. There's this sense of, I don't know what could happen, but it could be a lot of things. And it feels really exciting. There's a sense of kind of like December 24th when you're a kid, you know, what might I get for Christmas? There's a sense of just wonder and excitement. Those are usually clues, like breadcrumbs that are showing you like, oh, this is leading you. This is going where life is going. So if I go against what life is going, I feel fear immediately. I get right back into the scarcity. Oh, I start becoming conscious about potential lack. I start thinking about the future.
Anxiety may come up.
Anxiety comes up, you know, how's this going to work? And it's very subtle in the beginning. And again, this is a practice. So over time, as you learn how to shift this energy, you can catch it earlier and earlier. So you don't have to go down that road, you know, it's like you can catch it before you go down a weak bender where you're just in this, and then you're like, oh my gosh,
And then you're homeless and you're like, well, how did I get here?
totally. And then you catch it and shift it immediately. And it's a practice, but that's what to me alignment feels like. Exciting, expansive, possible. It helps me be I notice my presence increases when I'm in alignment. I'm able to just be where I am doing what I'm doing in that moment and not thinking about the future, or like need to get out of this or need to, you know, it allows me to have a much easier time sitting and being.
Yeah. And processing too. I know for me, like yesterday, when our show fell through, the old me probably would have been like, you know, like that's frustrating. I was ready and you know, the time was there, but the new me was like, you know what? It's not in alignment yet. It will be, and it will be when it will be. And honestly, what I did, Jamal, is I went and created another podcast. I went and did my own and put it out there. I had some inspiration. I had some energy move through, and there was a reason that needed to come through at that time. So I didn't waste the now moment, right? I utilized that now moment. I didn't waste it with frustration and stress and control and why didn't this, you know, happen? I actually utilized it and then I let it go. And then boom, here we are today having this beautiful conversation. And so I think when we are in alignment, we have a deeper understanding of when things don't work out the way we think they should work out, or they don't work out as planned. We have an easier capability, I guess, of surrendering to it and just letting it flow, right?
Absolutely. And one of the things I'm always reminded, because people always get fixated on the how-tos, how will this work? And, you know, we may want something, but there's obstacles beyond our control that are going to prevent us. And then that can create some fear. But I always say, whatever's in alignment, nothing can stop it. So for example, this conversation. So like, one of the things that is required for this conversation to happen is we have to be able to communicate at some levels, right? So we've been emailing, right? The email broke down. Like, I don't even know how that happens. Like, I email every day.
So into spam. I'm like, where'd he go?
My emails aren't getting through. And, you know, I spaced the call, the time yesterday, and then the emails aren't going through. But I had a deep awareness, like, oh, but this conversation is completely going to happen because it's in alignment with what is. So it's like, oh, well, okay, this will be interesting. My emails don't go through. We'll see how this works.
Yeah.
We'll see how, and here we are having this conversation, because when something's in alignment, there is no obstacle that can stop what is from manifesting.
I agree. And, you know, maybe our energy would have been different yesterday had we done this show yesterday. And maybe we're in a calmer place today. Who knows? Who knows why we were, you know, it's like, what is it? A misdirection is a redirection, or, you know, whatever that statement is. But, you know, there's a reason why this was all divinely planned and why we are here today. And, you know, and I think you and I both were living for a living. And when you do that, we're in a flow state, and you can't, the more you restrict or the more you try to control things or fit them, you know, into your plan, the harder it gets to live in the flow state. And so I've been really practicing that more in my life. It's like, okay, you know, that is in alignment right now. Doesn't mean it won't be in the future, but right now, in this now moment, I'm going to do what feels right for me, and I'm going to move forward with that. And so I'm just really glad that we were able to have this conversation today and that we were able to dive pretty deep. I feel like this was a pretty deep podcast. And so Jamal, tell us a little bit about the services that you provide.
Yes. Well, I'm a life coach by profession, so I typically work with folks one-on-one. I do some group events as well, but I have a podcast as well, and it's called the Love Cast with Jamal. Like I said, I have a book that's available to folks. It's called Living for a Living, and so those are primarily the arms of my work, and most folks can just find that through my website, which is jamaljivanjee.com.
Well, great. Well, Jamal, this was wonderful. Is there anything that you'd like to share that you feel would be of benefit to the listeners?
Well, I guess I would like to encourage your listeners to not that not that you need this, but I just feel I always like to do this when I'm on a show is it takes tremendous intention and focus to create a show like this, like the one you have. And sometimes listeners just kind of receive the benefit of that, and that's great. That's why you create it. But there's something about just knowing the intentionality that goes into this that I think helps us even receive even more. And I would just like to thank you for the energy and the focus that it takes for you to produce this show, because I know that's not quote unquote easy in the sense that it doesn't just happen. It takes a lot of intention. So these conversations, in my understanding, is what moves the needle, and for a lot of folks, it did for me. And I just applaud you for creating space, and I would love for the listeners to just to relish in that, and to know that what they're receiving is really, really valuable.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I don't look at this as work. I actually look at this as pleasure. So I know I'm in alignment because
Mm.
I don't get fearful when I do shows. I don't get stressed out when I do shows. I look at it as having a conversation with like-minded folks over a cup of tea, or so it's something that I just really enjoy doing. And so, like we've talked about this entire show, that is an example for me of how I know I'm in alignment, because it just flows
So
really
good.
easily, and guests come to me very easily, and the topics come to me very easily. And so I know you have a podcast too, so I appreciate all of the energy that you're putting out into the world, and I appreciate you taking the time to spend with me today. And thank you very
Of
much.
course. Of course. Thanks for having me.
You deserve to navigate your life in alignment with health, happiness, and abundance. To learn more about the services that I provide, including Beyond Quantum Healing Hypnosis, EFT tapping, and the Emotion Code, visit my website at www.theexistentialempath.com.